The sound of her palm striking my face was sharp enough to cut through the music, the murmurs, the soft clink of champagne glasses. It echoed in the open hall like a command no one dared question. For a heartbeat, the entire room froze. I tasted metal felt heat bloom across my cheek and knew without needing to look around that every eye was on me. "Don't just stand there, you stupid girl," she said loud enough to carry. Not a hiss, not a whisper, a declaration. I stood exactly where I was, my hands folded in front of me, my pulse steady in a way that surprised even me. The instinct to speak rose fast, urgent, almost feral. I could have ended it right there, one sentence, one name, one truth. But I didn't, because the woman who had just slapped me, the woman who believed she owned this room by birthright and fear, had no idea who I was. She didn't know I was the bride. She didn't know I was the woman her son had chosen. She didn't know that this wedding, this carefully curated display of power and perfection, had already slipped beyond her control. And in that single suspended moment, with my face burning and my dignity laid bare in front of strangers, I made a choice. I would not correct her. Not yet. I would let her believe exactly what she wanted to believe. Because some people only reveal themselves fully when they think they've already won. The room slowly began to breathe again. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat. The music resumed awkward and thin, like it wasn't sure it belonged anymore. No one rushed to my defense. No one apologized on her behalf. That silence told me more about this family than any whispered warning ever could. She stood there, my groom's mother, chin lifted, shoulders squared, looking at me as if I were a smudge on an otherwise perfect day. To her, I was an inconvenience, a faceless problem to be corrected, someone who had stepped out of line and needed to be put back in her place. I lowered my gaze, not in submission, but in calculation. Around us, guests avoided my eyes the way people do when they don't want to be asked to choose sides. Some looked embarrassed, others looked relieved it hadn't been them. A few watched with open curiosity, already deciding how this story would sound when they told it later. She adjusted her jacket satisfied and turned slightly away from me, already done. That more than the slap itself told me how often she did this, how practiced she was at humiliation, how confident she felt that there would never be consequences. I became very aware of my breathing, slow, even, controlled. I refused to give her what she expected. No tears, no protest, no trembling apology. The absence of reaction unsettled her more than any outburst could have. Someone nearby murmured something about timing. Another voice replied in a low, deferential tone. Orders, not suggestions. The hierarchy in this room was invisible but absolute, and she sat comfortably at its center. This was not just a wedding. It was a performance, and she was used to directing every scene. I looked around, taking in details I hadn't noticed before, the way people angled their bodies toward her, the way staff paused before acting, waiting for approval they pretended not to need, the way even kindness here felt conditional, something to be earned through obedience. My cheek throbbed, but the pain grounded me. It sharpened my focus. I saw how easily this moment could have turned into a story about my behavior instead of hers. How quickly I could have been painted as emotional disruptive, ungrateful. That was the trap. I felt it then clearly. This was not an accident. This was not a loss of temper. This was a test. A deliberate push meant to provoke me into revealing myself in the worst possible way. She wanted a reaction she could use, a scene she could justify, proof that I did not belong. I kept my hands folded. She moved a few steps away, already engaging someone else, her laughter light, dismissive. The slap to her was finished business. The bruise would fade. The moment would be forgotten. Order restored. I shifted slightly, stepping back into the edge of the room where I could see without being seen. It was a small thing, but it changed my position entirely, from target to observer, from subject to witness. That was when I noticed how carefully I had been placed all day, how often I had been redirected, how many times I had been told to wait, to stand aside, to let someone else go first. At the time, it had felt like chaos. Now it felt intentional. I understood something else then, something colder and more dangerous. Whatever she was planning, it wasn't over. The slap wasn't the climax. It was the opening move. The ceremony hadn't even started yet. I watched her from across the room as she spoke, smiled, nodded. She looked relaxed, pleased, as if she had just handled a minor inconvenience and moved on to more important matters. The confidence of someone who had never been challenged in a space like this. She had no idea that her certainty was the most useful thing she could have given me. I stayed quiet, as I was instructed to move again this time to a spot closer to the aisle. The direction came politely, almost kindly, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. I went where I was told, aware that eyes followed me, measuring, reassessing. Placed, not welcomed. I stood there, heart steady, mind clear, and let the humiliation sit where it belonged, not on me, but in the air between us. Let it linger for the people who had seen it and pretended they hadn't. Let it become uncomfortable. Because silence, I was learning, made powerful people reckless. She glanced in my direction once more briefly, just long enough to confirm that I hadn't caused trouble. Satisfied, she turned away again. I almost smiled. She thought she had put me in my place. She thought she had asserted control. She thought she had embarrassed the right person. What she didn't know was that every choice she made from this moment forward would be made in front of witnesses she could no longer control. That the stage she believed she owned was already shifting beneath her feet. And as the music swelled again and the room prepared itself for celebration, I stood there quietly, holding a truth sharp enough to cut through all of it when the time came. I let her believe she was finished with me. She wasn't. The sting on my cheek didn't fade the way pain usually does. It lingered warm and insistent, as if my body refused to let the moment pass unnoticed. Around me, the wedding continued to rearrange itself. Chairs scraping softly, voices lowering into polite conversation. Everyone eager to move on as though nothing improper had occurred. That was the first thing I noticed. How quickly the room recovered without me. People looked at me the way they look at a spill they don't want to clean up. Brief glances, eyes sliding away, sympathy carefully rationed. A woman near the aisle gave me a tight smile, the kind meant to acknowledge discomfort without inviting it closer. A man in a tailored suit adjusted his cufflinks and stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if reacting would somehow implicate him. No one asked if I was all right. To them, I was not the wronged party. I was the disruption, the misstep, the awkward pause in an otherwise flawless production. I understood then how everyone in this room saw me. Not as a person with a name or a place here, but as a role they had already assigned. Staff, perhaps. A coordinator's assistant. Someone peripheral enough to be corrected publicly without consequence. Someone whose humiliation could be justified as efficiency. It was easier that way. Easier than acknowledging cruelty. Easier than questioning power. I became aware of how often I had been moved throughout the morning. How frequently someone had intercepted me with a polite hand gesture and a practiced smile. Just a moment. Not yet. Stand here for now. Each instruction had seemed harmless in isolation. Together they formed a pattern of containment. I was being managed. The fact that no one recognized me as the bride was not an accident of timing or coincidence. It was the result of careful separation, controlled access. Decisions made long before today about who was allowed to see whom and when. I hadn't questioned it at first. Weddings are chaos by design. But standing there now with the weight of that slap still humming under my skin, the truth sharpened into focus. This wasn't disorganization. This was choreography. Someone had wanted me exactly where I was. I watched my groom's mother from across the room the way one might observe a skilled performer. She moved with ease, greeting guests, laughing lightly, her posture relaxed. There was no tension in her body, no lingering anger. The slap had cost her nothing. It hadn't even disrupted her mood. That confidence told me everything. She had done this before, not necessarily with a raised hand, but with words, with looks, with strategic embarrassment delivered at just the right moment. She knew how to make people shrink without ever appearing unkind to the right audience. Around her, the power structure of this family revealed itself in quiet ways. People leaned in when she spoke. Conversations paused when she passed. Staff anticipated her needs before she voiced them. No one contradicted her outright. They didn't need to. The rules were understood. Compliance was the price of belonging. I caught fragments of conversation as I stood there. A comment about standards, a remark about what's appropriate. The words were neutral, almost benign, but the tone carried something sharper beneath it. Judgment disguised as concern. Then I heard something that made my spine straighten. "We'll see how this goes," someone said, not loudly but not carefully enough either. A pause, a knowing hum in response. I wasn't meant to hear that. The way the voices stopped when they noticed me confirmed it. One of them smiled, too quickly offered a flimsy explanation about seating arrangements. I nodded, accepted it, and stayed exactly where I was. But inside, something locked into place. This wasn't just about putting me in my place. This was about watching me respond, about measuring, evaluating, waiting for me to make a mistake that could be framed as proof. They wanted me to fail. The realization didn't frighten me. It clarified me. I thought about how easily I could disrupt their plans, how one well-timed sentence could shift the narrative entirely. I could announce who I was. I could demand an apology. I could make a scene big enough that it would be impossible to ignore. But I didn't, because reacting now would give them exactly what they wanted, a spectacle they could reinterpret, an emotional outburst they could point to later as justification. Evidence that I was unfit, unstable, embarrassing. I had seen this tactic before, not in weddings but in boardrooms, in families, in places where power was protected by pretending it was benevolence. The moment you reacted, you lost. The moment you defended yourself too loudly, you confirmed their version of you. I refused to play that role. As I stood there, I noticed someone else watching me, not with curiosity or discomfort, but with interest. A woman positioned close to the groom's family, her expression composed, her gaze sharp. She didn't look away when our eyes met. There was recognition there, not of my identity, but of my restraint. She was paying attention. I filed that away without changing my expression. The ceremony schedule shifted again. A whispered instruction traveled through the room. I was guided once more to a different spot, slightly closer to the aisle this time. The movement was subtle, almost courteous, but it placed me directly in the line of sight of several key guests. Visibility without authority, exposure without protection. I understood the message. Whatever was coming next would happen in public. My groom was still absent from this part of the room, shielded by logistics and well-meaning distractions. That too felt intentional. Information was being filtered, controlled. He was being spared the mess until it could no longer be denied. I felt a flicker of something then. Not doubt, concern. He deserved to see the truth unfold with his own eyes, not hear it secondhand through competing narratives. And he would. I took another slow breath, grounding myself in the present. The sounds of the room faded into a low hum. I focused on details, the way my hands felt clasped together, the texture of the floor beneath my shoes, the weight of the moment settling into my bones. This wasn't the worst thing that had ever been done to me. It wasn't even the most humiliating, but it was the most public, and that mattered. Public moments leave marks. I thought about all the times I had been underestimated, all the spaces where people assumed my silence meant weakness, my patience meant permission. Those assumptions had always been their mistake, not mine. I saw it happening again now, unfolding exactly as expected. Another fragment of conversation drifted past me. This will tell us everything. That confirmed it. There was a test, and I was the subject. I kept my gaze steady, my posture neutral. I let them watch me and see whatever they needed to see to feel comfortable, calm, composed, unreactive, defeated if they needed that illusion. As the music shifted again and someone announced that the ceremony would begin shortly, I felt the room tighten with anticipation. Not celebration, expectation. They thought they were in control of what would happen next. I let that belief settle in heavy and false, because the truth has a way of surfacing when people grow careless. And the more confident they become, the more they reveal without realizing it. I stayed where I was, exactly where they had placed me, and waited. They believed this moment would define me. They had no idea it was about to define them instead. By the time the announcement came that the ceremony would begin soon, the sting on my cheek had dulled into something colder. Suspicion. The kind that settles quietly and sharpens everything it touches. I stopped thinking about the SLAP as an isolated cruelty and started seeing it as part of a pattern that had been forming all morning. The room didn't feel rushed the way weddings usually do in these final moments. It felt managed. People moved when they were told. Doors opened and closed at precise intervals. Conversations were redirected with gentle authority. What should have been chaotic felt rehearsed. I noticed how often my path was interrupted. Each time I tried to move toward where I thought I needed to be, someone appeared with a reason for me to wait. A hand lifted politely. A smile, always polite, always firm. I was never told no outright. I was simply delayed. The first time I brushed it off. The second time I paid attention. By the third, I understood. Every disruption affected me and only me. A small table meant for personal items had been relocated, forcing me to set my things elsewhere. A seat I had been directed toward earlier was suddenly reserved. A doorway that had been open minutes before was now closed with an explanation that didn't quite add up. Each irregularity alone was forgettable. Together they formed a quiet barricade. I wasn't being excluded by accident. I was being positioned. I watched the staff more closely then. Their eyes flicked toward my groom's mother before responding to questions. Instructions traveled through them without ever being spoken aloud. When she tilted her head or raised a brow, things happened. When she smiled, people relaxed. This wasn't loud authority. It was practiced control. At one point, I was guided toward a side corridor under the pretense of organization. The woman who led me there spoke quickly, not unkindly, but her grip on my elbow was firmer than necessary. When we reached the end of the hall, she hesitated, checked her phone, then apologized, and said plans had changed. I was escorted back out again. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute, but it told me everything. They were adjusting in real time, reacting to something unseen, or someone. I caught sight of my groom's mother again, conferring quietly with another woman near the front. Their heads leaned together, their voices low. When one of them glanced in my direction, the conversation stopped mid-sentence. The smile that followed was too smooth. I returned it and kept walking. That was when I realized how calm I felt, not numb, focused. The initial humiliation had burned away whatever uncertainty I might have had. In its place was clarity. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't being sensitive. Something deliberate was unfolding. I began to track it the way I would any other problem. Who spoke to whom? Who moved when she entered a space? Who avoided eye contact when I passed? Patterns emerged quickly once I started looking. There was a hierarchy here, and I was at the bottom of it by design. As I stood near the edge of the room, pretending to check something on my phone, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Two voices, low and close, speaking with the casual confidence of people who believed themselves unobserved. "She hasn't reacted yet," one of them said. "No," the other replied, "but she will." There was a pause, a small anticipatory silence. That's the point. My pulse slowed. They weren't speculating. They were waiting. I stepped away before they could notice me, my mind already rearranging what I'd heard. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment power play. It was a coordinated effort. A setup designed to provoke, to draw me out, to justify something that had already been decided. Whatever test they had planned, it required my participation. My failure, my loss of control. I refused to give it to them. As the minutes passed, I became increasingly aware of the audience gathering. Guests were being seated. Attention was being directed forward. The room's energy shifted from preparation to expectation. This would happen in front of everyone, public. I thought about how often people mistake composure for ignorance, how silence is read as compliance. They assumed that because I hadn't defended myself, I wouldn't. They were wrong. I noticed tension between two members of the groom's inner circle, then something subtle but unmistakable. A tight exchange of words. A look held a beat too long. It seemed unrelated at first, but I recognized the signs of a fracture. Disagreement being smoothed over for appearances, something unresolved. I filed it away. The closer we got to the ceremony, the more relaxed my groom's mother appeared. She laughed easily. Her shoulders dropped. She believed things were going according to plan. That belief made her careless. That was the danger of people like her. They confused obedience with loyalty, fear with respect. They forgot that control only lasts as long as no one questions it. I shifted my weight, grounding myself again. I could feel eyes on me measuring, waiting for tears, for anger, for something they could point to and say, that's who she really is. I gave them nothing. When the announcement finally came that the ceremony was about to begin, it arrived earlier than expected. The schedule had been accelerated. There was a faint urgency beneath the cheerful tone. I understood why immediately. Whatever they were planning, they wanted it done before variables could change, before conversations could happen, before the groom could see too much. This would happen fast. I was directed once more this time to a spot that placed me clearly within view of the first several rows. The positioning was precise. I stood where I could be seen without being central, visible but vulnerable. I took my place without protest. Around me, guests settled, programs, rustling whispers trailing off. The music softened, then paused. The air thickened with anticipation. I felt oddly steady, as if I had already crossed the hardest part. They thought I was unprepared. They thought the confusion, the interruptions, the humiliation had weakened me, that I would stumble when the spotlight turned my way. But the truth was, every obstacle had clarified my resolve. Every attempt to control me had revealed more of their strategy. This wasn't about standards or tradition or concern. It was about power, about proving who belonged and who didn't. And the irony was, by trying so hard to erase me, they had made me pay attention. As the first notes of the processional music began to rise, I lifted my chin slightly and focused on the aisle ahead. Whatever came next would not happen in the shadows. It would unfold where everyone could see it. They believed this moment would expose me. I knew it would expose them. I stayed where I was, exactly where they had placed me, and waited for the next move. The ceremony was minutes away when I made the decision not to fight back. It wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of courage or sudden clarity. It was quieter than that, a simple understanding that rose in my chest and settled there steady and immovable. Speaking now would serve her. Silence would serve me. The room had shifted from preparation to performance. Everything moved with purpose, as if invisible marks had been placed on the floor and everyone knew where to stand. Laughter softened, voices lowered, smiles became fixed. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about appearances. I felt the familiar pressure to explain myself, to correct the misunderstanding, to defend my dignity before it slipped too far out of reach. I could feel the words lining up behind my teeth, impatient, ready to be released. I swallowed them. I had seen this kind of woman before. Women who wrapped control in courtesy and cruelty and concern. Women who thrived on provoking reactions so they could reframe them as proof. If I spoke now, it wouldn't matter what I said. It would only matter how I said it. And she would make sure everyone remembered the tone, not the truth. Reacting would destroy my position. The imbalance was obvious if you knew how to look. She had numbers. She had familiarity. She had the unspoken loyalty of people who feared disruption more than injustice. I had none of that. Not yet. If I raised my voice, I would be emotional. If I demanded respect, I would be difficult. If I revealed myself too early, I would look desperate. Every path led to the same outcome, her version of the story becoming the official one. So I chose restraint. I stopped thinking of this as my wedding and started seeing it for what it really was. A stage, carefully lit, carefully arranged, every interaction designed to be seen from a distance and interpreted in her favor. Guests were no longer family and friends. They were witnesses, some willing, some reluctant, all important, and she knew it. I watched her from where I stood, the way she moved through the room with effortless authority. She smiled at the right moments, laughed at the right volume. Her timing was perfect. She knew exactly when to be visible and when to fade into the background, letting others do the work for her. She was counting on the audience. That realization changed everything. Someone stepped closer to me, then close enough that I could smell her perfume. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside me facing forward, as if we were both watching the same thing. When she finally did speak, it was barely more than a breath. "Are you okay?" It was the first time anyone had asked. I turned my head slightly and met her eyes. There was no judgment there, no curiosity, just awareness. She saw what was happening even if she didn't understand all of it. "I'm fine," I said quietly. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded once. No advice, no platitudes, just acknowledgement. She stepped away a second later, blending back into the crowd. But the exchange stayed with me. I wasn't as alone as they thought. I noticed then that my groom was still nowhere near me. His absence felt deliberate now, not coincidental. He was being kept busy, entertained, distracted, shielded from the undercurrents of the room, from the things that might raise questions too early. That worried me, but it didn't weaken my resolve. If anything, it strengthened it. He needed to see this for himself, not hear it filtered through explanations and excuses, not be told later what had happened and why it was supposedly justified. Truth lands differently when you witness it. I became smaller on purpose, not in spirit, but in presence. I stopped trying to navigate the room and let myself be placed. I didn't correct assumptions. I didn't assert importance. I let them think whatever made them most comfortable. Pride is easy to sacrifice when the timing demands it. Dignity is harder. I held on to that. The more silent I became, the more confident she grew. I could see it in the way she relaxed, the way her shoulders dropped. She believed the worst was over, that the slap had accomplished its purpose, that I had been properly handled. That confidence made her sloppy. She began to overreach, just slightly. A remark here, a look there, a moment of unnecessary commentary framed as guidance. Each small act revealed more of her intent than she realized. Silence has that effect on people like her. It removes resistance, and without resistance, they forget to hide. I was instructed again to move this time closer to the front. The direction came with a smile and a hand gesture that suggested kindness, but there was no room for refusal. I went where I was told, acutely aware of how carefully I was being positioned. Isolated enough to be vulnerable, visible enough to be useful. They thought they were setting the stage for me. In reality, they were setting it for themselves. As I took my place, I felt the weight of the moment settle into my spine. This was the point of no return. Whatever happened next would happen in front of everyone. There would be no quiet corrections, no private apologies. Public actions demand public consequences. I focused on my breathing slow and even. I let my face remain neutral, my posture relaxed. If anyone was watching for cracks, they wouldn't find them. She glanced at me again from across the room, just long enough to confirm that I hadn't become a problem. Satisfied, she turned back to her conversation, already moving on to the next detail. That glance was everything. She believed I had accepted my place, that I had been properly diminished, that silence meant surrender. She had no idea that silence was the most dangerous thing I could offer her, because the longer I stayed quiet, the more she spoke, the more she revealed. The more comfortable she became showing exactly who she was when she thought no one would challenge her. And when people like her grow comfortable, they make mistakes. The music shifted, signaling the final moments before the ceremony began. Guests straightened in their seats. Conversations died down. The room leaned forward, expectant. I stood exactly where I'd been placed, calm and ready, holding my truth close and sharp. I didn't need to announce myself. I didn't need to demand recognition. All I needed was time. They believed they were isolating me. I knew they were concentrating the spotlight. And when it finally turned, they would be standing in it with me. I noticed her because she didn't belong where she was standing. Everyone else clustered naturally, families forming loose circles, friends leaning toward one another with familiar ease. She stood apart close to my groom's family, positioned not like a guest, but like someone with a role. Her posture was confident, her smile measured, not celebratory, observational. She wasn't nervous. That alone set her apart. The way my groom's mother interacted with her confirmed it. There was warmth there, but not the performative kind she offered guests. This was different, protective, almost approving. She touched the woman's arm lightly when she spoke to her, leaned in to hear her responses. It was an intimacy I hadn't seen her grant anyone else that day. People deferred to this woman in subtle ways. They made space for her without being asked. She moved freely through areas others had been redirected from. When she paused near the front, no one suggested she relocate. Access like that is never accidental. I watched as she laughed softly at something my groom's mother said, her expression perfectly calibrated. Not too eager, not too reserved. Someone who understood exactly how much enthusiasm was expected of her and no more. I felt the shift then, a quiet tightening in my chest. This wasn't just about me and the SLAP. This wasn't even just about the family. There was another layer here, one I hadn't seen clearly until now. I overheard a fragment as I passed behind them, a reference to something that didn't belong to today. A date, a shared memory, a phrase that carried history with it. After everything my groom's mother said softly, the other woman nodded. We agreed. Agreed to what exactly? The words stayed with me as I moved away. My steps unhurried, my expression neutral. I didn't need the full conversation to understand its weight. This woman wasn't new. She wasn't incidental. She was part of something older, something decided long before today. That realization sharpened when our eyes met. It happened by accident, or at least it appeared that way. I was standing near the aisle, my attention outward, when I felt her gaze. I turned just as she was looking at me, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Recognition flickered there. Not recognition of my identity, but recognition of my position. She knew I wasn't supposed to be here. Her eyes lingered a second too long before she smoothed her face into something pleasant and looked away. But the moment had passed between us, unspoken and electric. She understood the game. A few minutes later, she moved closer, not directly toward me, but near enough that her presence registered. She said something to my groom's mother, low and private, then glanced in my direction again. This time there was something like assessment in her gaze. Then she smiled. It wasn't cruel. It was worse than that. It was proprietary. She made a small gesture, a hand placed briefly on my groom's mother's arm, a shared glance exchanged. Whatever passed between them didn't require words. They were aligned, coordinated. I understood then that this woman wasn't just observing the test, she was part of it. The realization should have rattled me. Instead, it clarified the stakes. This wasn't a single antagonist exerting control. This was a system reinforced by people who benefited from it, people willing to play supporting roles in exchange for proximity to power. I felt a familiar caution settle over me. Ambition wears many disguises, but it always reveals itself eventually. I watched her more closely after that, the way she positioned herself when my groom's name was mentioned, the way her smile sharpened when others deferred to her, the way she reacted just slightly too quickly to moments of tension. She believed she had a future here, a vested interest in the outcome of this day. That thought raised the emotional stakes in a way nothing else had yet. This wasn't just about humiliation or control. This was about influence, about shaping a life that wasn't hers to shape. I thought of my groom then, still absent from this part of the room, still being managed and redirected. Whatever history existed between him and this woman, it wasn't something he was currently acknowledging. Or maybe he wasn't being allowed to. That mattered. I felt a surge of protectiveness, sharp and immediate, not possessive, protective. There was a difference. I wasn't threatened by her presence. I was threatened by her intent. And intent always leaves traces. She made a mistake soon after, a small one, but telling. She spoke out of turn, offering an opinion on a detail that hadn't been raised. It was subtle enough that most people missed it. But my groom's mother didn't correct her. She deferred. That told me everything. This woman wasn't just tolerated, she was trusted. I didn't react. I didn't shift my stance or let my expression change. I simply noted it the way you note a loose thread you might need later. Silence had become my advantage. The less I said, the more they revealed. The more comfortable they grew, the more they assumed I wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. As the ceremony drew closer, I learned that this woman would play a visible role. Not center stage, but close enough to be seen. close enough to be associated with authority. She would stand where credibility could be borrowed and appearances could be shaped. Visibility is a dangerous thing for people who rely on shadows. I considered my options carefully. Exposing her prematurely would only push her deeper into defense mode. It would make her cautious, calculating, harder to read. Better to let her step forward willingly. Better to let her believe she was chosen. I glanced at her once more, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. She caught my eye again, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. She thought I was a problem she needed to manage. She had no idea how much she had just given me. Because ambition always overplays its hand eventually. It seeks acknowledgement. It craves visibility. And when it steps into the light, it forgets who turned it on. I returned my gaze to the front, my expression serene, my posture relaxed. I let the room continue to believe its own narrative, that the hierarchy was intact, that roles were fixed, that I had been diminished and would remain so. They believed this woman was safe because she was aligned. They didn't realize alignment is only protection when the foundation holds. As the music swelled again and people shifted into their final positions, I felt the shape of the coming conflict solidify. This wasn't just about surviving the ceremony anymore. It was about understanding the full scope of what I was up against. And I did. There were two of them now. One overt, one subtle, one confident in her authority, one confident in her proximity to it, both convinced I was powerless. I stood quietly in my place, letting them move forward, letting them prepare to take the spotlight they believed belonged to them. If she stepped into that light, she would not step out unchanged, and I would not have to push her. All I had to do was let her shine. After watching her move through the room with such quiet certainty, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Calm. Not the brittle kind that comes from pretending everything is fine, but a deeper steadiness, the kind that arrives when you stop reacting and start anticipating. The noise around me blurred into the background, and for the first time that day, I knew the balance had shifted. They were emotional. I was not. That difference mattered more than any title or introduction. For a moment, my mind slipped backward, not in panic, but in memory. Years ago, in a room far more unforgiving than this one, I had learned what restraint really meant. I had been underestimated then, too dismissed because I didn't fit someone else's expectations. I remembered sitting quietly while others talked themselves into mistakes, convinced my silence meant ignorance. When the moment came, I hadn't needed to raise my voice. I had simply waited until they exposed themselves. The lesson had stayed with me ever since. Standing here now, I recognized the same pattern unfolding, the same assumption. They believed my worth came solely from my relationship to the groom, that without his name, his protection, I was nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. They thought exposure would destroy me because they assumed I had nothing else to stand on. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that I had built a life long before this day one that didn't depend on their approval or their hierarchy. I hadn't walked into this room hoping to be accepted. I had walked in choosing to belong to one person, not an entire family. And that distinction gave me power. I noticed then someone else in the room, someone whose presence carried a different kind of weight. Our eyes met briefly, just long enough for recognition to pass between us. Not recognition of who I was today, but of who I had been before. They remembered me in a context my groom's mother had forgotten, or perhaps never bothered to learn. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. That silent acknowledgement was enough to confirm what I suspected. I was not as isolated as they believed. Not everyone here accepted the narrative being pushed so carefully around the room. From across the space, I caught sight of my groom at last. He stood near the entrance speaking with someone I didn't recognize. His posture rigid, his jaw tight. Even from a distance, I could see the strain in his movements. He sensed something was wrong. He just didn't yet know where to look. That mattered more than any confrontation I could stage. I watched him carefully, noticing the small tells others missed, the way his smile didn't reach his eyes, the way he paused before responding to his mother's gestures, hesitation creeping into habits formed over a lifetime. Doubt had taken root even if he wasn't ready to name it yet. I could have warned him then, pulled him aside, explained everything, but words spoken too early have a way of sounding like excuses, and I refused to be framed as defensive. He needed to see this for himself. Truth, I had learned, is most powerful when it arrives uninvited. As the ceremony continued to approach, the mood of the room shifted again. My groom's mother grew visibly more relaxed, her confidence returning in full. She believed the hardest part was over, that I had been contained, that whatever quiet resistance I possessed had already been neutralized. The other woman mirrored her ease, stepping closer, offering input without hesitation. They spoke openly now, less careful with their words. Assumptions slipped into conversation. Plans were referenced without disguise. Arrogance always does that. It assumes silence is agreement. I stood where I was, my posture loose, my expression neutral. If anyone had been watching me closely, they would have seen nothing worth noting. No tension, no fear, no indignation. What they couldn't see was the alignment happening quietly in my mind, pieces falling into place, timelines converging, people revealing exactly where they stood through what they chose not to say. I stopped thinking about survival entirely. That phase was over. Now it was about exposure. The groom's mother laughed at something the other woman said, her hand resting possessively on her arm. It was a gesture meant to communicate authority and alliance. She wanted it seen, wanted it understood, and it was. I saw it land on my groom's face from across the room, his brow furrowed, his attention sharpening. He hadn't heard the words, but he recognized the dynamic, the ease, the familiarity, the subtle exclusion. It unsettled him. That was the moment I knew I had chosen correctly. I felt no urge to rush forward, no need to force the issue. The pieces were moving now without my interference. The more they spoke, the clearer the picture became. The more comfortable they grew, the more they revealed their hand. They had planned for my reaction. They had not planned for my restraint. Someone announced an upcoming segment of the ceremony, a formal moment that would require participation from key family members. I recognized it instantly as the point my groom's mother had been waiting for. The moment she intended to assert control publicly to reinforce her version of events under the guise of tradition. She believed this would silence any remaining doubt. Instead, it would give me everything I needed. I adjusted my stance slightly, grounding myself once more. My pulse was steady, my breathing slow. There was no fear in me now, only readiness. The groom glanced in my direction, his eyes searching, questioning. I met his gaze briefly and gave him nothing more than a calm nod. No accusation, no plea, just presence. It unsettled him far more than tears would have. As preparations continued, I became aware of a subtle shift in how people looked at me. Not respect yet. Curiosity, reassessment. Something had changed even if they couldn't articulate it. Power follows credibility. And credibility was beginning to move. I heard my groom's mother mention the next step, her tone confident, assured. She believed she was guiding the day forward, unaware that she was walking straight into the moment she would later wish she could undo. I remained silent exactly as she expected. But silence, I had learned, is never empty. It holds intention. It gathers weight. And when she spoke next, when she stepped into the role she believed belonged to her unquestioned, she would give me precisely what I had been waiting for. She thought she was about to reclaim control. She had no idea she was about to surrender it. The calm that settled over the room before it happened was the kind that makes your skin prickle. Everything looked normal on the surface. Guests adjusted in their seats. Programs were folded and unfolded. Someone laughed a little too loudly as if to reassure themselves that this was still a celebration. But beneath it all, there was anticipation. They were waiting. The ceremony moved into a formal segment, one that carried weight and authority. This was the part where tradition spoke, where family voices mattered more than individual ones. I could feel the shift as attention subtly angled toward my groom's mother, as if the room itself understood who was about to take the lead. She stood with practiced ease, her posture composed, her expression warm in a way that felt rehearsed. This was her moment. She had chosen it carefully, a space where her words could not be easily challenged without appearing disrespectful. The stage was set. She began to speak, her tone measured, almost gentle. At first her words sounded like concern, gratitude, reflection. The kind of speech people nod along to without really listening. Then the edge appeared. She spoke about standards, about values, about the importance of knowing one's place within a family. Each phrase was carefully constructed, wrapped in language that sounded reasonable, while carrying something far sharper underneath. She never said my name. She didn't have to. Her eyes flicked in my direction just once, long enough to make the implication unmistakable. A pause followed, deliberate, heavy. The room understood. A few heads turned. Whispers stirred. This was worse than the slap. The slap had been crude, obvious. This was surgical. It was humiliation disguised as propriety, delivered with a smile and an audience. She was erasing me in front of everyone, framing it as guidance, as protection, as her right. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not from shame, but from clarity. This was what they had been waiting for. This was the test. Around me, reactions rippled through the crowd. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others smiled, faintly relieved to be on the right side of the line she was drawing. A few leaned forward, hungry for drama they could later recount as concern. No one interrupted her. That silence told its own story. I caught sight of my groom then. He stood rigid, his earlier confusion hardening into something else. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't nodding. He was listening now, really listening, and what he heard didn't sit right with him. I saw the moment it landed. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed slightly. He glanced at me, then back at his mother, as if trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the one standing in front of him now. This was the first time he truly saw her. My instinct surged again, fierce and immediate. I wanted to step forward, to speak, to reclaim myself in front of everyone who had just watched me be diminished. I didn't. I held still, my hands relaxed at my sides, my expression unreadable. I let her finish. I let her words hang in the air where they could not be taken back. Because if I interrupted her now, she would become the victim. If I challenged her directly, she would pivot, accuse, deflect. The focus would shift from her cruelty to my response. I refused to give her that escape. As she concluded, the other woman stepped closer, her presence reinforcing the message. She nodded along her agreement, visible, public. It was a mistake born of confidence. She wanted to be seen as aligned, as trusted, as part of the authority being asserted. In doing so, she revealed her hand. The room felt different now, not louder, tighter, as if something had snapped into place and everyone could feel it, even if they didn't yet understand why. Then something unexpected happened. My groom broke protocol. He took a step forward, not hurried, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The movement alone drew attention. Heads turned. The murmur of the room shifted pitch. "Just a moment," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried. Silence fell. His mother turned toward him, surprise flashing across her face before she masked it with concern. "Now isn't—" He didn't let her finish. The interruption wasn't aggressive. It was controlled, calm, and because of that, it was far more powerful. "I need clarity," he said, his gaze steady. "Before we continue." The effect was immediate. The authority she had been projecting wavered, just slightly, enough to be noticed. She tried to recover, to frame his question as nerves, as emotion, as something to be smoothed over. Her tone softened, patronizing. "This isn't the time, for it is," he said. That was when I realized something important. This humiliation hadn't destroyed me. It had exposed them. I noticed then that this moment wasn't just being witnessed by the guests. It was being documented in ways no one had planned. Not by me, not intentionally. Phones lowered too slowly, a camera meant for memories capturing something else entirely. The truth has a way of leaving records when it wants to. My groom's mother sensed the shift and pushed harder, her voice tightening as she tried to reassert control. The other woman echoed her too quickly, too eagerly. Together they overplayed their position. The room recoiled, almost imperceptibly. People began to reassess what they had just heard, what they had just seen. Authority without restraint is unsettling when it's suddenly questioned. I remained silent. Every word they spoke now dug them deeper. My groom looked at me again, his expression searching. This time I didn't look away. I met his gaze and held it, offering no explanation, no defense. Just the truth of my presence. It was enough. He turned back to his mother, something resolved in his posture. Whatever loyalty had once blinded him was giving way to judgment. The ceremony had stopped being a performance. It had become a reckoning. As the moment stretched, my groom's mother faltered for the first time, not dramatically, just a fraction of a second too long before responding, a hesitation that betrayed uncertainty. In that pause, everything changed. I felt it in the room, the subtle realignment, the way people leaned differently now, the way support began to shift quietly toward credibility rather than control. I exhaled slowly, the tension easing from my shoulders. They had tried to humiliate me into submission. Instead, they had given my groom the one thing they never intended to give him, a clear view, and once seen, it could never be unseen. As he stepped forward again, ready to speak, I understood that whatever came next would no longer be about enduring their power. It would be about dismantling it. The second humiliation hadn't broken me. It had marked the beginning of the end for them. The pause my groom created didn't just interrupt the ceremony, it fractured something far more fragile: authority. The silence that followed his words was unnatural heavy in a way that pressed against the chest. People shifted, unsure whether they were allowed to move or breathe. This wasn't part of the plan. Everyone could feel it. His mother recovered quickly, or tried to. She smiled, that familiar, practiced curve of the lips, and reached for him as if to steady a nervous child. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "this isn't the moment for questions. Let's not disrupt." He stepped back. It was subtle but unmistakable. Her hand fell to her side, the gesture hanging unfinished between them. For the first time all day, she wasn't directing the room. She was reacting to it. I watched the change ripple through her face before she masked it. Control for people like her is a performance. Once the illusion cracks, the effort to maintain it becomes visible. Her shoulders tightened, her eyes sharpened. "What clarity do you need?" she asked, still smiling, but now the smile strained. My groom didn't answer right away. He looked around instead, taking in the room, the faces, the tension he had created. It was as if he was seeing this space for the first time without the filter of obligation. Then his eyes found me. They lingered there longer than before, not with accusation, not with doubt, with recognition. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I met his gaze and held it calm and steady, offering him nothing but truth in its simplest form. "I am here. I am not what they are saying." That restraint unsettled him more than tears ever could have. He turned back to his mother slowly. "I've been noticing things today," he said. His voice was controlled, measured, but the tremor beneath it was unmistakable. "Things that don't add up." Her smile flickered. "Weddings are stressful," she replied smoothly. "Everyone's emotions are high. This isn't about emotions," he said. The other woman shifted beside her too quickly. She glanced at his mother, then at him, her mouth opening as if to interject before she stopped herself. The hesitation didn't go unnoticed. My groom noticed everything now. He continued, not accusing, not raising his voice, simply stating observations. He spoke about timing, about decisions made without him, about conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Each point landed quietly, precisely. The room leaned in. His mother attempted to reframe, to soften, to redirect. She spoke of tradition, of responsibility, of protecting him from unnecessary complications. The words were familiar, rehearsed, but they rang hollow. The more she spoke, the more defensive she sounded. Authority doesn't need to justify itself. Power doesn't need to explain. Everyone in the room felt that shift, even if they couldn't articulate it. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. Then he said something that changed everything. Why didn't I know about her? The question was simple, devastating. Her breath caught for just a fraction of a second before she answered. "Know about who?" He didn't look away when he replied. "You know who." The other woman stiffened. That reaction confirmed what words could not. I felt something loosen inside my chest then, Not triumph. Relief. He was seeing the dynamics clearly now, not just the individual moments, but the pattern beneath them. She tried to laugh it off to minimize the tension. "You're imagining connections that aren't there," she said. "This is a stressful day. Let's not overthink it." He shook his head slowly. "I'm not overthinking," he said. "I've been underthinking for a long time." That landed harder than any accusation could have. A murmur spread through the guests, quiet but unmistakable. People exchanged looks, reassessing what they had witnessed earlier. The slap, the speech, the positioning. It was all being recontextualized in real time. My groom took a step closer to me, then not reaching for my hand, not making a spectacle of it. Just standing near enough that the alignment was clear. Her composure cracked. "Are you questioning me?" she demanded, the softness gone from her voice now. "After everything I've done for you?" There it was, the pivot, from concern to sacrifice, from authority to martyrdom. He didn't flinch. "I'm asking you to stop speaking for me." The words hung in the air, clean and sharp. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first. The room waited suspended. When she did speak again, her voice was tighter, less controlled. "This is inappropriate," she said. "We'll discuss this later, in private." "No," he replied. One word, absolute. The effect was immediate. This wasn't defiance, it was a boundary. I felt eyes on me again, but this time the quality had changed. No longer dismissive, curious, reconsidering. I stayed exactly as I was, neither shrinking nor advancing. He turned to the officiant, briefly asking for a pause. The request was polite, reasonable, and impossible to refuse without acknowledging the tension everyone now felt. The ceremony halted. That alone was a statement. His mother looked around, realizing for the first time that the audience she had counted on was no longer firmly on her side. Control thrives in silence and compliance. She had lost both. The other woman attempted to step in, her voice too quick, too eager to restore order. "This is getting blown out of proportion," she said. "We all want what's best." He turned to her, and the look he gave her stopped her cold. "I didn't ask you," he said. That was it. In that moment, the hierarchy collapsed. I felt a strange calm wash over me, deeper than before. I had done nothing to cause this. I hadn't orchestrated it. I had simply refused to interfere with the truth revealing itself. He looked at me once more this time with something settled in his expression. Not confusion, not doubt, understanding. I felt no urge to rush toward him, no need to claim victory. This wasn't about sides, it was about clarity. As the room remained paused, suspended between ceremony and confrontation, I realized something important. I didn't need him to choose me over her in that instant. I only needed him to see, and he did. The trap was closing now, not with force, but with inevitability. The more they spoke, the more exposed they became. The more he listened, the less power they held. The wedding had stopped being about vows. It was about truth, and truth once acknowledged doesn't retreat. As my groom took another breath, preparing to speak again, I knew the next words would change everything. Not just for today, but for the future that followed. The ceremony could wait. This moment could not. The pause my groom called didn't dissolve the tension. It rearranged it. The room didn't relax. It recalibrated like a machine adjusting to a new setting. Conversations didn't resume so much as stall people waiting to see which way authority would settle before committing to movement. His mother tried to reclaim the rhythm first. She smoothed her jacket, lifted her chin, and offered a smile meant to reassure everyone that nothing had truly changed. "Let's continue," she said lightly, as if the interruption had been a brief technical issue. "We're running behind." A few guests nodded out of habit. Chairs shifted. Someone laughed, eager to move on. I stayed still. The illusion of normalcy is a fragile thing. It only works if everyone agrees to play along. She believed the moment had passed, that the damage was contained. She believed my silence meant compliance, and his pause meant nerves. She was wrong on both counts. The other woman stepped forward too quickly, her voice warm and confident. She offered to help coordinate the next segment, to smooth things over, to keep the day on track. It was a practiced move, the kind made by someone accustomed to stepping in when power wavered. By doing so, she confirmed her stake. My groom watched her carefully, the way you watch a puzzle piece finally click into place. He didn't respond immediately. He let her speak, let her offer solutions, let her position herself as indispensable. Then he asked a simple question. When did you decide that? The room stilled. She hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Decide what? To take charge, he said. To speak for us. Her smile tightened. She glanced toward his mother, a reflex she couldn't stop in time. That glance told him everything. Information fell into place then, not all at once, but in a sequence that made sense. The delays, the redirections, the public humiliation framed as concern, the private conversations that stopped when he entered the room, the way decisions had been made around him, not with him. This wasn't chaos. It was a plan. I could see it in his posture as he absorbed it, the way his shoulders squared, the way his voice lowered when he spoke again, steadier now. Who knew he asked? His mother laughed softly, a sound meant to disarm. You're reading too much into this. People talk. That doesn't mean who knew, he repeated, cutting her off. The question wasn't accusatory. It was precise. The other woman opened her mouth, then closed it. She shifted her weight, searching for an answer that wouldn't implicate her. None came. I felt the shift then unmistakable. Power follows credibility, and credibility had just changed hands. My groom turned slightly, addressing the room rather than either of them. If there's been planning, he said, I want to understand it. All of it. Now. A murmur moved through the guests, curiosity replacing discomfort. Authority figures near the front exchanged looks, uncertain how to proceed. This wasn't part of the ceremony, but it was happening in front of witnesses who could no longer pretend not to see. His mother tried again, her tone firmer now. This is not appropriate, she said. We'll discuss this later. No, he said. We won't. The finality of it startled even her. The evidence they hadn't accounted for arrived without drama. Not a dramatic reveal, not a confrontation staged for effect. Just a detail that refused to be ignored. A discrepancy in timing. A decision logged without his knowledge. A witness who spoke up because the room had shifted enough to make honesty feel safe. Truth arrived from the side, not the front. The story she had built began to buckle under its own weight. Each explanation created another question. Each attempt to smooth things over highlighted how much had been concealed. The other woman grew quiet, her earlier confidence draining away as eyes turned toward her with new understanding. Public alignments shifted subtly. People leaned toward my groom now, not out of loyalty, but because credibility had moved. The authority that once felt unchallengeable now required defense, and defense is always weaker than command. I remained where I was, my presence steady, my role unchanged. I didn't step forward. I didn't interject. When asked, I confirmed facts without commentary. Dates, moments, what I had been told, what I hadn't, nothing more. That restraint did more than any accusation could have. It contrasted sharply with their agitation, their need to explain, to justify, to regain control. The room noticed. His mother's composure began to fray. Not explosively, but in the small ways that reveal panic. A tightening jaw, a voice that rose half a note too high. She spoke of sacrifice, of family, of everything she had done for him. He listened, then shook his head. This isn't about gratitude, he said. It's about trust. The word landed heavily. She looked around, searching for allies, and found fewer than she expected. The other woman tried to intervene, but her voice no longer carried. Without protection, ambition collapses quickly. The room had chosen its center. My groom took a breath, then announced the next step with a calm that made it impossible to argue. He named a concrete action, something immediate and undeniable. A removal. An exclusion. A boundary that took effect now, not later. The reaction was audible. A collective intake of breath. Whispers. Shock. His mother stared at him, disbelief giving way to anger. You can't do this, she said. I can, he replied. And I am. The finality in his voice closed the trap completely. There was no room left for negotiation, no audience left to perform for. Authority had changed hands, not with force, but with clarity. I felt a quiet release, then the tension I'd been carrying loosening at last. Not because they were losing, but because the truth had taken root. Because the story could no longer be rewritten to make me the problem. The ceremony had been interrupted, but something far more important had been restored. As the room absorbed the fallout, I understood that this wasn't the end. Consequences would ripple outward from this moment, touching relationships, reputations, decisions made far from this room. But the hardest part was over. The trap had closed not with a snap, but with inevitability. And as the guests shifted, reassessing what they had witnessed, I stood quietly in the aftermath, knowing that what came next would be shaped by truth, not fear. For the first time that day, the silence felt earned. The room no longer felt like a wedding venue. It felt like a courtroom without walls, every chair a witness stand, every face a silent juror. The decorations remained, the flowers untouched. The music paused mid-thought, but the purpose of the space had shifted completely. My groom stepped forward and claimed the floor without raising his voice. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't explain himself. He simply stood there, centered, steady, and spoke as if this were always meant to happen. "We're going to clear something up," he said. The words were calm, but they landed with weight. Conversation stopped entirely. Even the smallest movements seemed too loud now. No one interrupted him, not even his mother. She tried to smile again, but it didn't reach her eyes. That smile had always been her shield, her way of signaling control without force. Now it looked thin, almost fragile. He didn't look at me when he began. He looked at her. "I've been hearing pieces all day," he said. "Fragments, half explanations, enough to know there's a story being told that I wasn't included in." She opened her mouth, ready to redirect, but he continued before she could. "So let's tell it properly." The room leaned in. He spoke without accusation, without heat, laying out observations instead of conclusions. Timing that didn't make sense. Decisions made without him. Moments of disrespect brushed aside as misunderstandings. Each detail was small on its own, easy to dismiss. Together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. As he spoke, I watched the faces around us change. People who had smiled politely earlier now looked uneasy. A few glanced at one another, clearly connecting dots they hadn't wanted to see before. His mother interrupted him, then her voice sharp beneath the practiced calm. "You're misinterpreting events," she said. "This is not the place for—" "It is exactly the place," he replied. That was the first time I saw real shock on her face. Not anger, not irritation. Shock. She had never expected him to contradict her publicly. He turned slightly, addressing the room, now widening the circle of accountability. "This is our wedding," he said, "and if something has been done in our name, we have the right to understand it." The other woman shifted uncomfortably. She had been so confident earlier, so eager to align herself with authority. Now that authority was being examined, and she didn't know where to stand. He asked a question, then simple and direct, and it cut through the tension like a blade. Who decided she didn't belong here? Silence answered him. Not denial, not outrage. Silence. I felt eyes on me again, but this time they didn't carry judgment. They carried recognition. I stayed still. My hands relaxed, my expression neutral. This wasn't my confrontation to lead. His mother scoffed lightly, trying to dismiss the question with disdain. No one said that, she replied. "You're exaggerating." He didn't argue. He simply waited. That was when the narrative began to collapse. Someone spoke up, quietly at first. A comment about instructions they had received, a clarification about a change that had been requested earlier. Another voice followed, then another. Nothing dramatic, just facts offered cautiously now that the room had shifted enough to make honesty possible. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It emerged in pieces, each one undermining the story his mother had built. Timelines didn't align. Decisions contradicted one another. The explanations meant to smooth things over only highlighted how much had been concealed. The other woman tried to distance herself, stepping back verbally, reframing her involvement as helpful rather than directive. But her earlier confidence betrayed her. Her words didn't match her actions, and people noticed. I was asked a question then, not by him, but by someone else, gently, respectfully. I answered it simply. Dates, conversations. What I had been told, what I hadn't, no commentary, no emotion, just facts. The contrast was stark. As they grew more agitated, I remained composed. As they explained and justified, I confirmed and clarified. The room absorbed that difference instinctively. His mother's composure cracked, not in a dramatic outburst, but in the way her voice wavered when she spoke next, in the way she appealed to emotion instead of authority. She spoke of family, of sacrifice, of everything she had done to protect him. It sounded like a plea. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once, slowly. "I'm not questioning your intentions," he said. "I'm questioning your actions." The distinction mattered. She bristled, anger flaring now that control had slipped beyond reach. "After everything I've done for you," she said, her voice rising, "you're choosing this." "I'm choosing honesty," he replied. That was the moment she lost him. Not because he raised his voice or issued a threat, but because he refused to accept a version of reality that required him to ignore what he had just witnessed. He drew the line clearly, then naming the boundary without cruelty, without hesitation. He made it public not to punish, but to prevent revision. This decision would not be rewritten later. The immediate consequences followed quickly. Support drained from around her people, stepping back instinctively, unwilling to be associated with what was now unmistakable. The other woman was left exposed, her alignment no longer an asset, but a liability. I felt something settle in the room then. A release. Not relief exactly, but clarity. The air felt different, lighter, as if everyone could finally breathe without pretending. He turned toward me at last. Not to apologize, not to explain, just to stand beside me. The gesture was quiet, unremarkable on the surface, but its meaning was unmistakable. Alignment, not performance. Choice, not obligation. The room understood. He announced a concrete step next, something immediate that changed the structure of the day. A removal. A redirection. A consequence that could not be undone or delayed. The reaction was immediate and audible. Shock rippled outward, followed by whispers, then silence again. His mother stared at him as if seeing a stranger. The authority she had wielded for decades had evaporated in minutes, replaced by something far more frightening to her. Irrelevance. As people began to move, reassessing where they stood, I felt the weight I had been carrying finally ease. Not because this had ended neatly, but because it had ended honestly. The reckoning had come not with shouting or spectacle, but with truth spoken plainly and boundaries enforced without apology. The ceremony could wait. What mattered had already happened. The room after the reckoning felt unnaturally quiet, as if the walls themselves were trying to absorb what had just happened. The flowers still smelled sweet. The chairs were still arranged in perfect rows, but the celebration had drained out of the space, leaving behind something heavier and more honest. People didn't rush to speak. They didn't know how. Guests who had once leaned toward my groom's mother now found reasons to look elsewhere. Conversations stalled when she approached. Smiles faded mid-curve. It wasn't cruelty. It was instinct. When credibility disappears, so does gravity. People drift away without meaning to. She stood there suddenly alone, her posture rigid, her eyes darting as if searching for support that no longer answered. The other woman hovered a few steps behind her at first, then farther back, then not at all. Alignment evaporates quickly when it stops being useful. I watched it happen without satisfaction, not because I felt sorry for her, but because the aftermath of power is never loud. It's quiet, clinical. It looks like space opening up where certainty once lived. My groom didn't linger in the center of the room. He didn't bask in attention or explanation. He moved away deliberately, speaking to a few people in low tones, taking control of details that had never belonged to him before. I noticed how naturally it came to him now, how unburdened his movements seemed. He wasn't punishing anyone. He was reclaiming himself. That distinction mattered. His mother tried once to pull him aside, her voice sharp with urgency. He listened for a moment, then shook his head. Not angrily, just decisively. He said something I couldn't hear, but I saw the effect of it. Her shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in fear. This consequence, whatever it was, had not been part of her calculations. Losing an argument was one thing, losing access was another. The other woman made her own attempt to recover. She approached a small group near the aisle, her tone lighter, her smile careful. She tried to reposition herself as neutral, as helpful, as misunderstood. But without protection, her confidence rang hollow. People nodded politely and stepped away. She had built her relevance on proximity. Without it, there was nothing left to stand on. I felt the tension begin to leave my body, then slowly, like a held breath, finally released. My shoulders dropped. My hands stopped clenching. The adrenaline that had carried me through the day drained away, leaving exhaustion in its place. Relief came with it. Not triumph. Relief. For the first time since arriving, I felt safe. My groom found me a few minutes later, away from the center, near a quiet corner where the noise softened. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside me close enough that I could feel the warmth of him without needing to look. "I should have seen it sooner," he said finally. I shook my head gently. "You saw it when it mattered." He exhaled a sound that carried more weight than words. "I'm sorry you had to stand through that." "I chose to," I replied. "And I meant it. I needed you to see it without my voice in the way." He nodded slowly. There was no defensiveness in him now, no need to explain or justify, just understanding. That was enough. We stood there for a moment longer, not speaking, letting the quiet settle. Around us, the room began to reorganize itself, not into celebration yet, but into something workable, honest. I noticed who stayed close, who checked in without asking questions, who offered support without curiosity. Those gestures mattered more than any apology I hadn't received. Family reveals itself under pressure. Some people I had expected to matter disappeared into the background, suddenly busy elsewhere. Others I barely knew stepped forward, offering water, a chair, a simple nod of respect. The hierarchy had shifted not by decree, but by instinct. My groom's mother watched this transformation with growing panic. The role she had assumed was permanent was dissolving in front of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Influence can't be demanded once it's gone. At one point, she caught my eye. There was no apology there, no remorse, just disbelief, and beneath it, something like resentment. I held her gaze briefly, then looked away, not out of weakness, but because there was nothing left to say. The wedding did not end. It changed. A decision was made, quietly, efficiently, without announcement. The schedule adjusted. Certain roles were reassigned. Certain voices were no longer invited to participate. The structure shifted to reflect what had already happened emotionally. The future was being shaped in real time. As the hours moved forward, the sharpness of the moment softened into something steadier. Conversations resumed slower now, more thoughtful. Laughter returned in cautious waves, not forced, earned. I felt something settle into place inside me, a sense of sovereignty I hadn't realized I was holding back. I hadn't been saved. I hadn't been rescued. I had been seen. That mattered more than any public defense. My groom and I exchanged a look across the room, later a silent check-in. He smiled, not the polite smile of earlier, but a real one, grounded, certain. Whatever came next, it would be chosen together. As I took a seat for the first time that day without being directed, I thought back to the moment that had started everything. The slap, the insult, the humiliation that had felt so absolute at the time. It no longer defined the day. What defined it now was what followed. The clarity, the boundaries, the quiet courage of refusing to disappear when it would have been easier. Consequences, I realized, don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like absence. And sometimes that absence is exactly what allows something better to take its place. As the room continued to settle into its new shape, I knew this wasn't the ending I had feared when I first arrived. It was a different one. And for the first time all day, I believed it might be the right one. The silence that settled over the venue felt different now. Not tense, not fragile, just honest. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed and the air finally knows what it's supposed to be again. The decorations were still there, exactly as planned. The flowers hadn't wilted, the chairs hadn't moved, but the weight had lifted. The space no longer belonged to fear or performance, it belonged to choice. We made a decision together quietly without consulting anyone who didn't need to be consulted. The ceremony would continue, but not the way it had been scripted. No grand announcements, no explanations offered to satisfy curiosity. We stripped it down to what mattered and let the rest fall away. Traditions were adjusted. Some were skipped entirely. Others were softened, reshaped to fit the truth of the moment instead of the expectations of people who no longer had a say. I felt myself stand differently as it happened. Not taller, lighter. My groom stayed beside me, not as a statement, not as a shield, but as a partner. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He didn't brace for reaction. His presence was calm, grounded, unbothered by the absence of approval he once would have chased. That told me everything I needed to know. When he spoke to the room again, it was brief, clear, free of apology. He thanked those who had stayed, those who had respected the pause, those who understood that sometimes the most important moments aren't the ones you rehearse. No one interrupted him. No one needed to. I looked around, then really looked, and saw the shape of a different family forming. Not the one defined by blood or hierarchy, but by behavior, by who stepped forward when things were uncomfortable, who offered support without demanding explanation, who stayed quiet when silence was the kinder choice. Family, I realized, isn't proven in celebration. It's revealed under pressure. As we stood there, ready to begin again on our own terms, a memory surfaced uninvited. The sting of the slap, the heat in my face, the sound of her voice calling me stupid as if it were a fact everyone should accept. It felt distant now, not erased, but diminished. That moment no longer had the power to define the day or me. Dignity doesn't always come from fighting back. Sometimes it comes from refusing to disappear. The ceremony resumed in a way that felt almost intimate, stripped of excess, focused, honest. When the vows were spoken, they weren't performative. They were grounded in reality, shaped by what we had just lived through. Every word carried weight. I felt the presence of the guests not as an audience, but as witnesses to something real, not a spectacle, a boundary being set, a partnership being chosen in full view without permission from anyone else. There was no need to look toward the back of the room anymore, no need to wonder who approved or disapproved. That chapter had closed itself. When it was over, there was no dramatic release, no explosion of emotion, just a collective exhale. Smiles that felt earned, laughter that didn't rush to fill silence, but arrived naturally in its own time. I caught myself smiling without realizing it. Later, as the evening softened and the formal edges of the day gave way to something warmer, I found a moment alone, not isolated, just alone enough to breathe. I thought about how close I had come to speaking too soon, to correcting her, to defending myself in a way that would have satisfied the moment but cost me the outcome. Silence had been misunderstood as weakness. In truth, it had been restraint. There's a difference, and it took me years to learn it. Restraint doesn't mean swallowing who you are. It means choosing when and where your truth will land with the most impact. I didn't win by being louder. I won by staying present long enough for the truth to reveal itself without my help. As the night continued, I watched people interact in ways that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Roles had shifted, lines had been redrawn. The world hadn't ended because one person lost control. It had improved, and that, more than anything, felt like justice. Before the evening ended, I took one last look at the space where it had all begun. The place where I had stood humiliated and silent while the room waited for me to break. I hadn't, and because I hadn't, everything changed. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been dismissed, talked over, or made to feel small in a room that expected your obedience, I see you. I know how heavy that moment can feel when it's happening, how permanent the humiliation seems. But moments pass, truth doesn't. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever chosen silence over reaction only to watch the truth unfold on its own? Or did you wish you had shared your experience in the comments? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you want to stay with me for more stories about quiet strength, earned boundaries, and the moments when the tables finally turn, consider subscribing. You're always welcome here. Thank you for listening.